Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to our afternoon panel entitled African Religious Movements and Democracy. Can everybody hear me? I have the somewhat disorienting feeling of speaking to myself. Okay, great. The joy of Zoom. My name is Noah Solomon, and I teach Islamic Studies in the Religious Studies Department here at the University of Virginia. It's truly an honor to be here today with you all, particularly after such engaging colloquia in the morning, from Professor Mamdani's truly powerful keynote to the excellent papers we heard in the earlier panel. I want to thank Professors Ogunaike and Vincent for their generous invitation to be part of the event, and to both them and Ashley Duffalo for all the work done in organizing it. I know it was a lot of work to bring this all together. This panel, African Religious Movements and Democracy, explores, as the conference organizers put it, how religious movements have been and continue to play a central role in the public sphere of African societies, driving social and political change, both shaping and challenging the dominant ideological, socio-economic, and political formations. From prophetic politics of protest to poetry to anti-colonial militant movements, the papers in this panel explore the roles African religious movements have played in defining, changing, and challenging their socio-political orders. We have 6 extremely distinguished panelists presenting on this topic, and I'll introduce them here at the outset before we take the very same format as the previous panel, wherein each panelist presents for 10 minutes, followed by around 5 minutes of questions. Like the last panel, we probably won't have time for the 10-minute break, particularly as we have one more panelist on this panel. And then hopefully there will be a little bit of time at the end for a wrap-up discussion that might bring these topics together. So let me introduce the panelists. Our first paper comes from Professor Osman Khan. It's entitled The Bilad al-Sudan, Scholarship in Islamic Cosmopolitanism. Professor Khan, a scholar of Islamic studies and comparative and Islamic politics, joined Harvard Divinity School in 2012 as the first Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Professor of Contemporary Islamic Religion and Society. Professor Khan studies the history of Islamic religious institutions and organizations since the 18th century, and he is engaged in documenting the intellectual history of Islam in Africa. Professor Khan has also focused on the phenomenon of Muslim globalization. His book, Homeland is the Arena, Religion, Transnationalism, and the Integration of Senegalese Immigrants in America, looks at the community of Senegalese immigrants in the United States in New York and the importance these immigrants assign to their religious communities for the organization of their lives. His other books include Muslim Modernity in Postcolonial Nigeria, Beyond Timbuktu, an Intellectual History of Muslim West Africa, and most recently, Islamic Scholarship in Africa, New Directions in Global Contexts. Our second paper from Medina Cham is entitled Tijani Archipelago, Pan-Africanism and Decolonization in Mopti. Medina Cham is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a Mellon ACLS fellow. In September of this year, she will join New York University as assistant professor of history. Cham works on Mali and the Sahel with broad interest in African migrations and the connected social and intellectual histories of Islam across the Atlantic and Saharan worlds. Her PhD thesis, entitled Seeking Freedom in the Sahel, Mobilities, Connectivity, and Islam, 1804 to 1960, probes historical intersections between freedom, mobility, Islam, and political change in the region, adopting a global and micro-historical approach. It draws on research she conducted in Mali, Senegal, France, England, Ireland, and Jamaica. Her research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, American Historical Association, and African Studies Association, among others. In addition, she's a member of the Projet Archives des Femmes, a Bamako-based digitization project that is collecting, safeguarding, and creating a public archive of papers of Malian women involved in the 1950s movement for independence and post-colonial feminist activism. She's also part of a working group on contemporary migrations in Southern Africa. Our next paper will be from Abrima Saul, and it's entitled Religious Leaders as Mediators and Power Brokers in West Africa. Abrima Saul is the executive director of Trust Africa, a Pan-African foundation that promotes responsible citizenship and accountable leadership and champions inclusiveness that is founded on justice. He has also in the past held other senior positions, including as executive secretary for Codestria from April 2009 to June 2017, and senior research fellow at the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, Sweden. Abrima is a member of the expert group supporting the work of UNESCO's Global Commission on the Futures of Education and the Scientific Advisory Committee of UNESCO's Management of Social Transformations program. He is the co-author and editor of several publications on higher education, academic freedom, social movement, citizenship, governance, and post-conflict transitions in development in Africa. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne. He was a postdoctoral fellow of Yale University's program in agrarian studies and a senior research fellow of the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. Our fourth paper comes from Professor Robert Vinson, and it's entitled Through the Spectacles of Ethiopia, Prophetic Garveyite Politics in Segregationist South Africa. Robert Trent Vinson is director and chair of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies here at the University of Virginia, and a research associate at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He is a scholar and teacher of 19th and 20th century African and African diaspora history, specializing in the transnational connections between Southern Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean. His first book was The Americans Are Coming, Dreams of American Negro Liberation in Segregationist South Africa, excuse me. And his second book was Albert Luthuli, Mandela Before Mandela. Professor Vinson currently serves as president of the Association for the Study of Worldwide African Diaspora, the world's premier professional organization of African and African diaspora scholars. He also serves on the board of directors of the African Studies Association and on the editorial board of Michigan State University Press and of Safundi, the Journal of South African and American Studies. Professor Vinson earned his PhD in African history from Howard University. Prior to his appointment at UVA, he taught at Washington University in St. Louis, and more recently at William and Mary, where he was Francis L. and Edwin L. Cummings Professor of History and Africana Studies. At William and Mary, Vinson was also the first chair of the Lemon Project, which documents, preserves, and disseminates scholarship that uncovered the college's long histories of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. Our next paper will be from Nasima Mohammed. It's entitled Religion and Philosophy in the Zimbabwean African People's Union Army. Dr. Mohammed is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Virginia's Frank Batten School of Public Policy and Global Policy Center, where she researches, teaches, and writes on the connections among education, conflict, and public policy. A Zimbabwean Rhodes Scholar, she graduated in 2014 with an MSc with distinction from Oxford's Comparative and International Education Department and holds a BA as well from Harvard University. From 2015 to 16, she served as the Director of African Programs for Harvard's Pre-Text Initiative, an arts-based teacher training program that promotes creativity, leadership skills, and critical thinking in kindergarten through university classrooms. She is the co-founder of two organizations, African Ivy, an organization that helps African students apply to universities, and of the Center for African Cultural Excellence in its flagship Writivism workshop that hosts writing workshops across the African continent and links published African writers with aspiring authors. Our last paper will be from Ayodeji Ogunnaike. It's entitled Yoruba Political Ontology, Non-Competitive Democracy, and the Sacrality of Power. Professor Ogunnaike is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Bowdoin College. Professor Ogunnaike teaches interdisciplinary courses on Africa and the African diaspora that center around the important role religion plays in these communities. His research focuses mostly on Yoruba Orisa worship in Nigeria, but also addresses Islam in Africa, Christianity in Africa, and diaspora religions, Brazilian candomblé in particular. Having studied Ifa divination with a high priest and diviner in Nigeria, he has a keen interest in indigenous African intellectual traditions and ways of knowing. His current book project, How Worship Becomes Religion, analyzes how the worship of traditional Yoruba deities originally differed greatly from Western notions of religion, but eventually became the most widespread and celebrated indigenous African religion through contact with modernity and mission Christianity. He is also currently working on a children's book of Yoruba mythology with his brothers Olodamine and Olomakinde, and has been developing and curating an online library of Ifa orature. Please join me in welcoming these 6 esteemed panelists to our session. Just to remind you, audience members, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post questions at any point during the talk, because we'll want to get right into the question session after the talk. Our speakers will be able to see your questions, or at least I will read them, and they will field them as time allows following their talks. We will begin with Professor Khan's paper. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Noah, for the introduction. And I also thank the organizers for inviting me to present. I will read a summarized version of my paper entitled The Bilad Sudan Scholarship and Islamic Global Cosmopolitanism. Before the rise of Islam, the Arabic language was spoken only on the Arabian Peninsula. It became a global language after the transmission of the Quranic revelation in the 7th century. As Islam expanded, hundreds of millions of Muslims throughout the world adopted Arabic as a language of worship in which they said their 5 daily prayers. Arabic also became a language of scholarship in which Arabs and many non-Arab Muslims wrote substantially. As proven by the Encyclopedia Arabic Literature of Africa, sub-Saharan African scholars have made a solid contribution to all fields of Islamic knowledge. Because they attracted scholars and students from different regions of the world who engage in intellectual conversations pertinent to the affairs of Muslims worldwide, Islamic centers of learning in Egypt, the Maghreb, the Sahara, and the Sahel created together a global Islamic cosmopolitanism long before the modern period. Scholars from all over the world traveled widely to such centers to impart and/or acquire knowledge and receive knowledge certification. Some returned to their homeland to share the acquired knowledge, others settled permanently in their host societies, and of these some became prominent teachers. Scholarship was peripatetic and linked to traditions of pilgrimage. The most important such pilgrimage is the Hajj, and alongside and associated with the Hajj is the practice of visiting mausoleums of prophets, martyrs, companions of the prophets, and venerated Sufi saints in Africa and Asia. Over time, these sites became not only realms of memory where pilgrims venerated those figures, but also centers of learning where scholars engage in intellectual pursuit. My paper looks at centers of learning and intellectual exchange in Morocco, Cairo, Mecca, and Medina, in addition to Africa, where scholars from different parts of the world rubbed shoulders in the last few centuries. And in the paper, I give an overview of prominent West African scholars in such centers of learning, and I will start with the Maghreb. Moroccan centers of learning, especially Fez and Marrakesh, have attracted West African students and scholars for centuries. Founded by the Almohad dynasty, the city of Marrakesh, for example, has a tradition of Islamic learning which spans a period of 1,000 years. There are tales of prominent scholars from West Africa whose talents left deep impression in the city, one of them being Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Kanami, and as his name indicates, he originates from Kanem in the Lake Chad region, where the Islamic presence goes back to the year 46 of the Islamic calendar. Kanem is the first region of West Africa to have developed a tradition of Islamic scholarship and to have cultivated strong ties with Egypt. And evidence of such ties includes a residence for students and pilgrims from Borno established in the 13th century in Cairo. Another piece of evidence of the existence of an elaborate writing culture in medieval Borno is a diplomatic letter dated 1391 and sent by May Usman bin Idris of Borno to the Mamluk ruler Ali al-Malik al-Zahir Barquq. In itself, it establishes the presence of scribes with a high degree of mastery of the Arabic language and diplomatic convention in the royal entourage of Borno in the late 14th century. Little is known about the life and education of Al-Kanami, but we know that he traveled to Marrakesh sometime before the year 1198. That he was received by the Almohad Sultan suggests that he might have been part of a diplomatic mission, particularly since Sudani and Maghribi states have maintained strong relations for centuries. Though in itself his work has not been preserved, many Arab historians and encyclopedists have quoted lines of his poetry. If Afro-Arab relations have at times benefited mutually from diplomacy and peaceful trade relations, those relations have at other times been at odds through war, conquest, and enslavement. The most dramatic episode of conflict took place in the late 16th century when the Saadian monarchy of Morocco, headed by Ahmad al-Mansur, solicited from the Songhai ruler logistical assistance to contain the expansion of Christians who had reconquered most of the Iberian Peninsula. Al-Mansur received some assistance, but less than what he expected, and despite the objection of many pious Moroccan scholars to his plan to attack Songhai, a country professing Islam, Ahmad al-Mansur sent an expedition to Songhai that defeated the Songhai army in 1591 and ended the Songhai Empire. In the aftermath of the conquest, the Moroccan expedition force suppressed all resistance to the Moroccan occupation, and prominent Songhai scholars were arrested and their libraries confiscated and shipped with them to Morocco. All these scholars died of plague in Morocco except Ahmad Baba at Timbuktu. And after 2 years of house arrest, Ahmad Baba was released and invited to teach in one of the most prestigious mosques of Marrakesh. And besides his teaching, he also composed several pieces of work, and some of his students became very influential scholars and helped consolidate his reputation. Cairo now. Al-Azhar in Egypt has been a major center of Islamic learning for all over 1,000 years and has attracted students from all over the world, including Black African students. And in the 18th century, 3 of the 25 residents of Al-Azhar hosted students from West and Central Africa. As evidenced by those residents, many students and pilgrims from West Africa spent time to acquire knowledge. They studied with Egyptian ulama from whom they obtained knowledge certification. They also took back home with them the scholarly work of Egyptian scholars, and the Timbuktu Chronicles mentioned that many Timbuktu scholars studied with Egyptian polymath Abdurrahman al-Suyuti, who died in 1505, and those Timbuktu scholars taught his work, especially his exegesis of the Quran, Tafsir al-Jalalain in Timbuktu during a Suyuti lifetime. Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, the author of the Ajaib al-Athar, the marvelous compositions of biographies and events, which covers the history of Egypt from 1688 to 1821, devotes a long necrology to a West African scholar named Muhammad al-Kathinawi, and the necrology of al-Jabarti discusses the life story of al-Kathinawi, including his studies between Katsina and Borno, where he received his training in Quran, Hadith, theology, fiqh, and was introduced to other disciplines such as literary and linguistic, historical, mathematical, philosophical, medical, astronomical, esoteric, and occult sciences. And of all his work, the Adur al-Manzum is the most famous, as it displays knowledge of scientific and cosmological theories prevailing over the centuries in all the Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions, as well as their precursors in classical antiquity, as documented by Dalia Al-Khubara in her work. Africa, now Mecca and Medina, or the Haramain, West African scholars have a long history of connection to the Haramain, Mecca and Medina, and regardless of their race and ethnicity, most of them were called Takarina, a name which derived from Takrur, a state which flourished in the Senegalese River Valley at the turn of the second millennium, and the first Sudanese state to adopt Islam. Among the Takarina who left a great impression in the Haramain is Umar al-Futi Utal, who visited the Haramain who arrived in the Haramain in 1827, and he spent most of his time in Mecca and Medina, and he was appointed there Khalifa of the Bilad Sudan for the Tijaniya, and later on he left a rich intellectual legacy, including his most remarkable work, Kitab Rimah al-Hizb al-Rahim ala Nuhur al-Hizb al-Rajim. And at the turn of the 20th century, the Haramain passed from the rule of the Hashemites to that of the Al Saud dynasty. And again, West African scholars who came there counted among very influential Wahhabi scholars, one of them being Abdurrahman al-Ifriqi. So now I will conclude, for the sake of time, that prior to European colonial rule, the Dar al-Islam was a large discursive space linking local networks of scholars to global centers of learning in Mecca, Medina, Cairo, Fez, Jerusalem, Timbuktu, and more. I didn't have the time to discuss Timbuktu in my presentation, but I discussed it in the paper. And Islam's call for universalism opened the door for Muslim people from all origins to participate in scholarship, and Islam's ability to integrate the best of all civilizations paved the way for the integration of scholars, Arab and non-Arab, from near and far, of different shades of color, to create a cosmopolis of scholarship. And in this cosmopolitan world, particularism were not totally irrelevant, and prejudice toward racial and ethnic others not totally absent. Nevertheless, scholars from different geographic regions and racial origins engage in mutually beneficial intellectual exchange. As Muslims, literate in Arabic and fluent in the Islamic sciences, scholars had the cultural competence to adjust to any new settings, and the learned and the pious among them prospered. Race was a very flexible notion and not a determinative factor in status. What really mattered was piety and high status with God, and West African scholars were able to flourish in North Africa and the Holy Land, just as Arabs and others flourished in centers of learning in in Africa south of the Sahara. So I have just used 10 minutes of my time, and will be happy to answer any question.
Okay, let me, if it's okay, use this opportunity to ask Professor Khan my own question. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the question of structures of learning. We have so much literature, of course, in the study of Islam in Africa, on how colonial structures of learning come to transform what's often called traditional African modes of study, or Islamic modes of study, but we have such little information on pre-colonial struggles within places like Africa, within the Dar al-Islam, as you put it, over what modes and models of knowledge transmission were possible and advantageous. I'm wondering if your work speaks to that at all, about the multivocality that must have been present prior to the colonial intervention around African structures of learning or Islamic structures of learning.
Thank you, Noah, for this question. Scholars who worked on the core curriculum or the texts that circulated, that were most taught in different regions of the Muslim world, whether Sub-Saharan Africa or North Africa or the Haramain, they agree that there is a core curriculum, of texts that were taught. I mentioned that scholars of Timbuktu, for example, studied in Cairo. Many studied with Abdurrahman Suyuti, and some of them were teaching that Tafsir al-Jalalain by Suyuti and al-Mahalli during the lifetime of Suyuti and many other works. So in terms of the text that were taught, I think this, pretty much similar texts were circulating in the whole, Islamic discursive space, So therefore, there was a great deal of similarity. Now, on how knowledge was transmitted, or the structure of learning, I think, it was mostly transmitted orally. The most reliable mode of knowledge transmission was oral. Scholars used text; they wrote text, but transmission, the most viable, the most reliable mode of knowledge transmission was oral. From one master to another, and knowledge certification, was in the form of an ijazah who could be written or oral, given to the by a master to the student. But of course, you know all that. So so that's what I could say about the structure of learning. Now, how was it organized broadly? I think as opposed to modern settings, it was in mostly in mosques or in houses of masters that they taught their students, and it was teaching was a service to the community, and most of these students, they didn't pay. They may have reciprocated by offering various service, working to the master, but this is what I can say, very quickly, how I can answer that question.
Thank you so much. We just have time for one question, and a question's come in from Carl Johnson. His question is, how fluid was the Islamic religion with handling so-called indigenous religions in pre-colonial or pre-contact Africa in the Sudanic West African region? For example, do you think it was possible in pre-colonial Africa to have a relative in the same family, both indigenous and Islamic, accepted in the same family in the earliest transitional periods? I think there was an extra phrase in there, but I hope you got his question.
Well, we know that there are two schools of thought. One is the Swarian tradition, Salim Sware, documented by the work of Lamin Sane, and based on the idea that peaceful coexistence with the Gentiles was recommended, and as long as Muslims could practice their faith, they shouldn't impose it to others. On the contrary, through education, they should provide a model of how Islam should be practiced until the time in which God would decide that other people would convert to Islam. So that for a long time that tradition existed, and there is also the other tradition of people who use other means, like maybe who are more prompt to attack their opponent and to spread Islam militarily. So both traditions existed. And now on the question of coexistence of people or within the same family of different faith, there again, there are regions where it's where that happened more. And the work of, for example, Ayodeji Ogunaike explained how Islam, and Christianity and traditional religion coexisted peacefully in among the Yoruba, for example. So I guess it depends on the areas and the periods, but the two paradigm are the Swarian tradition and that of the most jihadi traditions, and they have coexisted. And there are regions where there is greater tolerance to for religious pluralism than others.
Thank you so very much, Professor Khan. We need to move on, and the next speaker is Medina Cham.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me fine? Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much for the organizers for putting this together. It's been lovely to listen to all the interventions in the panels and get all these ideas flowing in. I guess the main questions that are driving the paper that I'm presenting today are the following. What compels a Muslim colonial subject to take part in political action with a secular anti-colonial political party? And what political futures was this African Muslim colonial subject imagining for his communities during the 1960s era of decolonization in the French Sudan? So those are the questions that drive the paper today. And the paper is set between the years 1956 and 1960 in the city of Mopti, which was located in the French Sudan. So the French Sudan is the colonial name of today's Mali. And throughout the talk, I'll use the term Sudan to refer to Mali, just so it's clear. And with that, let me start. So in January 1956, at a polling station set up in his neighborhood in the city of Mopti, in the French Sudan, a man named Mamadou Cham cast his vote for the French National Assembly election. Cham was a religious scholar, a trader, and a migrant who originally hailed from the Fouta region of Senegal and had settled in Mopti after over a decade of itinerancy. He did not speak nor write French, and his tenuous connections to the colonial administration were mostly limited to his fiscal and administrative obligations. And so, in other words, he largely sought to avoid rather than engage with the colonial state and the state in general. So why did he decide to partake in elections stemming from a French political culture that was not legible to him, as legible to him, at least as it would have been to French educated Africans? What compelled him to engage in electoral party politics? And what meaning or resonance could debates held in the Sudan Territorial Assembly or even further away in the National Assembly in Paris hold for him? So Cham had been born in the last decade of the 19th century, or in the cusp between the 19th and the 20th century, right at the onset of the colonial invasion. And he very much lived in a liminal world that was still marked by the afterlives of the 19th century jihad of Omar Foutiyou Tall, which had colored his experience of 20th century French colonization. And so to try and understand the choices that he would have made in the era of decolonization, I adopt an analysis that moves across spatial, temporal, and historiographical borders, and that straddles the social histories of Islam in the pre-colonial and colonial Sahel with political histories of decolonization in French West Africa. When he headed to the polls, Mamadou Cham did so as a registered member of a party, the USRDA, which stands for Sudanese Union African Democratic Rally. The party had been founded when a group of left-leaning politicians from across French West Africa, from across French Africa, had decided to establish a large coalition. And therefore it was the only party to be explicitly Pan-African in nature, with a string of chapters dispersed across the French colonial territories. Very well represented among the ranks of the USRDA party were people who were nothing like Cham, and he said who belonged to the French educated classes or the ranks of organized labor. Those were low ranks African public servants in the colonial system, workers in the postal service, in the railways, in the docks, or in other industries, nurses, doctors, and a large number of teachers. And so I argue that to join this group of people who were actively rallying for the USRDA party, Cham had to develop a political vision for decolonization that was grounded in local histories and local epistemologies. And so this argument takes seriously the resonance and the relevance of translocal pre-colonial history in shaping his decolonial politics. Specifically, I think there were two main influences on his choice of political activism for the US RDA party. One, the first influence. As I mentioned, before moving to Mopti, Cham had engaged in itinerancy throughout West Africa. His trajectory had taken him across multiple colonies of French West Africa, including Burkina Faso, Senegal, the French Sudan, Ivory Coast. And his decade-long travels across various clerical centers in key cities that had a big influence of the Tijaniya, the Sufi Brotherhood. Cham's travels across these cities were illustrative of what I term a Tijani archipelago, which expanded across West and North Africa, and which trumped the logic of the colonial borders and partitions that the French were erecting. Indeed, in their worldview and in their geographical imagination, itinerant Sahelian Muslims, like Mamadou Cham, did not subscribe to the idea or the relevance, I should say, of national borders in that moment. Instead, they conceived of their territory as a string of Tijani islands connected to one another through a shared culture, language, historical memory, and religious practice. Those were places where Tijani history, memory, and culture was inscribed and continuously re-inscribed through the accumulated biographical experiences of itinerant Tijani disciples. And so moving through this archipelagic formation would have eroded in Cham's mind the relevance of colonial border, and instead it would have reinforced his own sense of anchoring into cross-border communities tied together through kinship, spirituality, and shared epistemes. And so it is this form of like archipelagic and cross-border construction of belonging and construction of a sense of being part of one community that Cham cultivated that would have facilitated his adherence to an explicitly Pan-African party that had chapters across multiple colonies of the French Empire over the nationalist or local formations that also competed in the Mopti political sphere at the time. And I won't have time to get into details of what these other parties offered, but this is something that will be in the paper. And so that was the first reason, the cross-border community building and belonging that had been fostered by the Tijaniya. The second reason for his adherence into the US RDA anti-colonial political party and his activism within this party has to do with something else. So in Mopti in the 1950s, the US RDA party very strongly mobilized the political language of illegitimate chiefs and illegitimate and unjust rule to chastise local African chiefs. So African chiefs working for the colonial administration had been an essential institution in the enforcement of colonial rule, particularly in the coercive collection of taxes and in the violent imposition of forced labor. And so when the US RDA launched their campaign, their decolonial campaign, the main sort of like strand of anti-colonialism that they adopted was to adopt a very strong rhetoric against these chiefs who they argue did not have legitimacy to rule and did not have legitimacy to rule the African public in Mopti and in the French Sudan in general. And I think this type of discourse would have resonated with Cham, with Mamadou Cham. Indeed, since the 18th century, the idea of the, bringing up the true legitimacy of rulers had been a core concern of Sahelian Muslim political thought. And the claim to free Muslims from the yoke of illegitimate chiefs had been a leitmotif in Sahelian Muslim political language. That rings true for, I think, leaders of the Torobe Revolution, for example, the region that Cham was originally from, who had led the revolution in the late 18th century on that basis to fight against illegitimate chiefs. It was also true for leaders of the Masina Revolution in 1818 and so on and so forth. And so I think this was the frame of reference that Cham would have likely tapped into in listening to political speeches in Mopti in 1950. So to be clear, I'm not saying that the grievances that the US RDA party leveled against African chiefs in the era of decolonization had much in common with pre-colonial quests for legitimate and just Islamic governance. I don't mean to suggest a direct correlation here. Instead, what I'm trying to suggest is a more careful reading of how Mamadou Thiam and likely others would have listened to and made sense out of the political speeches that they were hearing in Mopti in the 1950s. And so to do that, we need to be attuned to the kind of like intellectual, spiritual, and social spaces that Thiam inhabited in order to understand how he interpreted political discourses during decolonization. And so I think the USRDA's discourses against chiefs, in order to understand that, he would have tapped into that well of knowledge that he had about these pre-colonial discourses and debates stemming from the Muslim world about the legitimacy or non-legitimacy of chiefs ruling over African Muslims in order to, to make sense out of what was going on around him in Mopti. And so in sum, in conclusion, Mopti in the 1950s was as much a post-jihad society as a society in the midst of decolonization. And so decisions about supporting a Pan-African anti-colonial party, at least for one member of the public in Mopti, bore echoes of 19th century local histories and epistemologies. And so this is important to keep in mind because I think it's important to keep the focus on how pre-colonial histories informed ordinary Africans' decisions about which political futures they wanted to build. And these histories are therefore crucial to take into account in order to add to our understanding of 20th century history of decolonization and indeed of world making after empire. All right, I'll stop here and I hope I did not go over time.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Questions, everyone? Okay. Do we have any questions? Please ask. I don't want you to have to hear from me again. So I'll give people a minute or so to just in case people are typing things up. But that was a great talk, Medina. And the panelists are welcome to ask questions. Okay, we have a couple questions coming in, and I'm being told by the organizers to try to limit it to one question just because of time. So I'm going to try to combine them a bit. Well, they're different sorts of questions, but I'll ask them at the same time. One question from Abena Apiofori. How did women influence this movement? And the next from Danielle Widman Abraham. In addition to the pre-colonial and local histories, could you talk a little bit about the impact of World War II on the French Sudan in terms of shaping imaginations of political futures of Mamadou Thiam?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to, I guess, address very briefly both questions, and then hopefully afterwards, maybe I can respond directly to people. So women were definitely key to this movement. I think specifically the USRDA, the political party that Thiam ends up joining, did a very big effort of outreach to rally the vote of women, particularly rural women. There's one, I think the sort of like best known example of that was in the figure of Awa Keita, who was a very influential political activist in Mali during the time of decolonization, who ends up joining this party and who does a lot of like, campaigning and rallying on behalf of the party, to rally the vote of women, both in urban centers with French educated women, but also in the rural communities. And so the vote of women was extremely important. Also because women were actually a specific category of women were actually among the first one to get the right to vote in the French Sudan. It was women who were mothers and who were mothers of 2 children who needed to be either alive or child who was died in the course of service for France. So fighting in the colonial wars. So actually in the French Sudan, a lot of women gained the right to vote before other categories of men were able to do so. And so they were very, very influential in this political process. And they definitely rallied, they made choices in terms of which Sudanese political party they wanted to rally for. And they were very adamant about their choices. You have a lot of like testimonies and examples of like street fights, for example, popping up in markets in the Sudan among market women who were belonging to different political factions and things like that. So women were definitely a key part of this process. And then too, on the impact of World War II on this time period, it was definitely very important for many reasons, right? Both in terms of how the colonial state approached expanding the right to vote to members of the Sudanese public. So as I was saying, for example, earlier, some of the first women to gain the right to vote need to be the mothers of 2 children who are either alive or one of them dead while fighting for France in the colonial wars. So you see that this category of the people who fought for France is very important. And to fully, I guess, understand the impact of these people who come back from the colonial, from World War II in particular, who come back into Sudan, these veterans, and now form a category that the colonial state has to figure out how to deal with, right? In terms of like how to either co-opt their action, or are they enemies, are they not? Do they support the action of the state? The management of these veterans becomes something that's very important. Of course, the work of Gregory Mann, his book Native Son covers at length this issue of the veterans, including how they end up voting, and they end up voting for the other main party that competed against the USRDA in the French political sphere. That was a more conservative party that, unlike the USRDA, actually did everything that they could to rally the support of chiefs. And there's a very interesting intersection there in terms of like why veterans from World War II decide to rally for that more conservative party as opposed to the explicitly Pan-African and explicitly anti-colonial USRDA party. And maybe if we have more time later, I can get into that. But for sure, World War II had a big impact.
Thank you so much. And you should know, Medina, there are several other questions. We don't have time for them right now, but I think they'll be sent over to you. Thanks so much for a great presentation. Next up is Dr. Ibrima Sall.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me also begin by thanking Udamini and the organizers, and actually everybody, for the invitation and for arranging everything. I am focusing not really very much on West Africa as a space, but recentering my presentation on Senegal and Gambia more specifically, but looking at religious leaders, their roles, particularly in the context of the Gambia, how that role evolved. When we had a head of state who also claimed the role of a religious leader among his attributes. Islam in this part of Africa is Sufi Islam, as we know, with large confraternities, the Murids, the Tijaniya and its various subgroups, the Qadiriya, the Layan, and these are the main groups in Senegal, and that have extensions in the Gambia as well. And the heads of these groups become very influential people in society and in politics, and they become the sort of the moral authorities, powerful voices in times of crisis, and everybody speaks to them. The head of state, the ministers, the opposition political parties, social movements, trade unions, where in terms of a crisis, a standoff, they all go to them to speak to them and seek their persuade them to intervene to resolve the crisis. Now, this is the situation predominantly, and it's also to a lesser extent the case in the Gambia as well. And what happened in the Gambia was in 1994, a group of junior army officers staged a coup The eldest of them was 29, the youngest 25. And then they instituted a military regime, but a regime that was in power for 29 years, with liberal democracy as its main sort of functioning. And the person who headed that group is Yahya Jammeh. And after a while, Yahya Jammeh began also assuming different roles and calling himself different names. So his name began getting longer and longer and longer. He became a sheikh, and then he got the title of Nasruddin, the title that he dropped in 2014. But in the process, what happened was later on, in December 2015, in a political rally, he decided that Gambia would become an Islamic republic, right, with immediate effect. And the announcement, of course, took everybody by surprise. And the full implication of the move was not really well known by anybody, because there was no change in the constitution and no constitution adopted, for the purposes of having it serve the Islamic Republic. In the process, Jammeh announced that this was a way of continuing the colonial movement, sort of, breaking away from Western traditions and colonization. He had 2 years earlier on got Gambia out of the Commonwealth, so this was sort of a declaration of the Gambia as an Islamic Republic was like a logical continuation of that whole process. But the 22 years during which he was the head of state actually are marked by, brutality, basically. It was a very authoritarian regime. He positioned himself, projected himself as an African, a fiercely independent and anti-imperialist African leader who was much more interested in African values than in values or universal values, or so-called universal values, as it is called them, of human rights and democracy. And that the only authority, the only power he recognized is that of Allah, and that if Allah wished, he would rule the country for 1 billion years. In his appearances, he looks like he was a devout Muslim walking around with a copy of the Quran in one hand, a rosary, and a sword in the other hand. So this is the image that he was projecting, and then of course with the title of a sheikh and a professor and Nasruddin attached to his name. The fact of the matter is, a lot of the things that were happening under his rule were actually in contradiction to that sort of image that he was projecting. And first of all, because he assumed the role of a leader, and including a religious leader, he had no respect for the religious leaders of the country. And he sort of was actually arresting so many people, and those arrested included prominent religious leaders who were held in detention incommunicado for extensive periods of time. In one case, probably it was actually almost like 6 months, in which nobody knew where he was, under horrible conditions. So he sort of sought to assert his authority over the religious leaders in a very brutal way as well. And the regime was characterized by horrendous violations of human rights. Terrible episodes documented extensively by the human rights movements. The question, though, is the proclamation of the Gambia as an Islamic Republic in practice did not change much in terms of the way things were going. He decreed a dress code for everybody, but the dress code was abandoned shortly afterwards. And at no point was Sharia going to be the rule, the principle that is governing the Islamic Republic. I mean, we know that from Bernard Lewis. The concept of an Islamic Republic was first used in Pakistan in 1953, as a way of saying that the republic would be governed by the Islamic faith and Islamic law. Now, Islamic law was at no point the main thing that was governing the state in the Gambia, even when it was proclaimed an Islamic Republic. Now, what this meant in effect was that it was a way in which Jammeh, in the context, it needs to be understood very well. He was, because of the violations of human rights and the tensions he had with the West, increasingly isolated on the international scene. Again, I mean, living in the Commonwealth, and his new friends were regimes like Iran and Venezuela, under Chavez, and Turkey, and the Gulf states of the Middle East, who didn't pay much attention to the violations of human rights, and we are not critical of him for what he was doing there then. Now, there was also a lot of contestation from within the country, including from some of the religious leaders who felt very uncomfortable with what was happening there, and that was why some of them were arrested and others went into exile under his rule. Now, what is interesting to note is that the practice, there were not only serious violations of human rights in a very massive way, but also because Jammeh had also this claim to have mystical powers that enabled him to do almost everything. He could cure HIV/AIDS, diabetes, infertility, and cancer, and was also, against what he called witchcraft, and went in an all-out war against witchcraft, and had a lot of people arrested, hundreds of people arrested, and subjected to horrible treatments. And so all that didn't go down well with the people, and in the end, added to that, there was a certain level of xenophobia as well, where he began calling certain groups to be very, including the majority ethnic group, the Mandinka, as foreigners who had no claim to any possibility of leading the country at any point. Now, although he claimed that the declaration of the country, the proclamation of the country as an Islamic Republic was in line with the religious identity and values of the Gambians, it didn't sort of correspond to what people seem to aspire for. Now, this is the impact of the proclamation of the Gambia as an Islamic Republic in terms of what it had on the people was actually profound. It was a traumatic experience, particularly for the religious minorities, the Christian minority, but also the other non-Muslim minorities that were in the country. It also, in some respects, emboldened the Salafist movements that were in the country. One of whose members was appointed Imam of the State House Mosque that was built on the Jammeh. So the questions around what actually it meant to be an Islamic Republic, wasn't very clear at all, in the context of the Gambia. What it did was it sparked of the debate on the place of religion in the country, and we saw this actually in a much more important way when Jammeh lost the elections in 2016 to a coalition that brought in the current president was elected massively when it through a democratic process, and the reforms and the number of commissions were set up that sort of unveiled the level of corruption that was going on the Jammeh, and the level of harassment and brutality that was happening on him. But it also revealed the level of trauma, in a sense, that existed, because one of the most important issues that are debated, one of the new constitutions that was being developed in post-Jammeh era was the issue of secularism. Right, a number of people being very particular in making sure that secularism is included in the new constitution, as you have in the case of Senegal, for example, as a way of making sure that we'll never again will have a president having the powers to declare the country an Islamic state. And in that post-Jammeh era that the religious leaders also sort of, when the situation became very tough, began joining the movement and began being very critical during this. There was a standoff at one point when he lost the elections, and religious leaders resumed their role of being spokespersons and leaders of, including protest movements. At that particular point in time, there were those who also went to tell Jammeh that he had lost the elections and he had to leave. But the important point I want to make here is that the identity of the republic, the Islamic Republic, wasn't very clear. It seems to have been, to a certain extent, an opportunist move to declare Gambia an Islamic Republic as a way of winning friends, new friends, particularly those of the Gulf. Although the rhetoric was against the West, the fact of the matter is Jammeh's relationship with the US has been very ambivalent all along. He had a mansion in Washington, D.C. He had suspected to have been hosting some of the secret detention centers of the CIA in the Gambia. And the very point about calling it an Islamic republic. Republic is something obviously that is of Western origin. In the context of the Gambia, it didn't signify really a major break from the type of state that he seemed to have been calling for. Now, I think what I try to do in this paper is to point to the conditions under which actually the religious leaders continue to play their role as brokers and mediators. It seems that under authoritarian conditions, that role was reduced to insignificance because the head of state himself claimed that role of being the leader and of being the person who had to be one calling the shots at every given moment. Secondly, the conceptualization of the Islamic State was very, very unclear, and the issue of secularism, which even in Senegal is debated occasionally, particularly when it comes to issues having to do with family law and so on, or succession law, is an issue that remains very, very important in the context of most West African countries, in particular those with Muslim majorities, and how different groups would relate to the state, and the state having a sort of an equidistance between the different groups and different religions. It's become a very, very important issue for debate in the context of the Gambia as well. Well, just a few of the summary of the issues that I'm raising in the paper, which I'll make available at some point. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. We have a little bit of time to take questions from fellow presenters or from the audience. I'll give people a second to get their questions together. Ayodeji has a question, and you can just, I think, turn on your mic and camera if you wouldn't mind.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you, Dr. Saul, for this fascinating paper. I knew a certain amount about Jammeh, but I've learned all kinds of things I didn't know, especially his links with the CIA. I had no idea that was going on. So thank you for this very thought-provoking paper. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was that thinking about the role or interaction between prominent political leaders in West Africa, prominent political leaders and then also religious figures, it's almost unthinkable for me to imagine a presidential candidate in Nigeria actively distancing himself from, say, Pentecostal pastors or the Sultan of Sokoto or something like that, and then being able to exercise power effectively. Or say in Senegal, if you distance yourself from the sheikhs of the Tijaniya in particular, or the Muridiya, it's very difficult to imagine how you could effectively hold on to power there. And so I've heard rumors from people that Jammeh had all kinds of occult power that he was using to hold on to the office. But apart from those rumors, I'm curious if you think, or why you think he was able to do this. Was it because he viewed them as perhaps the most legitimate threat to his holding on to power individually, and he found other means of checking their power? Or is it just maybe that there weren't as many major centers in the Gambia as, say, in Touba or in Kaolack in Senegal? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because it strikes me as one of the curious and interesting particular cases about the Gambia and Jammeh. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. Should I answer now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, no. That's a great question, Deji. Thank you very much. I mean, first of all, many of the groups in Senegal had, as I said, extensions in Gambia. So the Murids in Gambia actually, have the Khalif General of the Murids in Touba as their main spiritual guide. The Tijans have the same, different whether they're affiliated to the Sheikh Ibrahim Niass branch of the Tijaniya, or to the Tijaniya, branch that is in Tiwawan, or to other Tijaniya groups. So that's the situation. However, the issue is in terms of the influence of these religious groups. You are right. No no political leader would want to alienate them for any reason. And although we have seen that the religious groups also don't have the same level of influence in terms of the electorate as they used to have. I mean, the disciples would now not always, follow the recommendations that the religious leaders would give. The Nigel, as they call it, in time of elections, say that, look, we are calling upon you to vote for X candidate or for Y candidate. And we used to be the case previously in Senegal, and I think now they've stopped doing it because it doesn't always work. But the more important thing is, Jammeh actually had no respect for anybody. I think there's a stage that they reach at which they don't seem to be seeing, any reason for, paying particular attention to any. He had confrontations, with some of the religious leaders. In fact, one of whom is very well known, very prominent one. He bought him a very fancy car, and I think the man sort of objected to something that he did. He went and confiscated the vehicle from him. So that I think that was Jammeh. It sort of reminds people of Abacha in Nigeria, where at one point you have the feeling that they are not listening to anybody. So I think when they reach a certain stage in their life, as they tend to think that they actually have all the powers and little demigods, who cannot allow themselves. And that's actually when they begin to get towards the end of their own. I mean, when they're actually nearing their own demise. And that's what happened with Jammeh. He completely lost it at one point. And so he was taken by surprise by the defeat that he had in December 2016, because people were tired of the different things he was doing, and the brutality and the harassment of religious leaders in particular, something that didn't go down well with many of them. The big heads of the confraternities were talking to him. They were, but he wouldn't listen. That's the problem. He wouldn't listen. And I think at one point that's what happens to them when they stay long in power and they think that they have, some kind of special gifts or divine powers that put them almost at the same level as the religious leaders themselves. And that seems to be what had happened with him at some point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sal. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Professor Robert Vinson discussing his paper, Through the Spectacles of Ethiopia, Prophetic Garveyite Politics and Segregationist South Africa.
Hi. Thank you so much, Professor Solomon. This paper provides a more expansive notion of politics in the Union of South Africa, and then looking at the segregationist period 1910 to 1948. The paper illustrates the political and religious prophecies of deliverance and the supposedly secular political Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, and the ideologies of Garveyism and segregation in South Africa. Most of us know that the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, was the largest Black-led movement in world history by many estimations, with 2 million members and followers in over 43 countries and 1,000 individual chapters spread throughout the world. And many were attracted to the UNIA's very ambitious agenda to include shipping lines and corporations and universities, a Liberian colonization scheme, a resolute desire to reconstitute African independence, and a fierce racial pride that infused the organization. Now, outside North America and the Caribbean, these aims and ideals that are generically called Garveyism had their greatest impact in South Africa, with more than a dozen official and unofficial South African UNIA chapters. Now, despite the UNIA rallying cry of Africa for the Africans, many studies of Garveyism, and in fact, larger studies of the African diaspora period, often regard Africa and Africans as obligatory reference points to tell stories of Black people outside of Africa. Now, more recently, Garvey scholars have moved beyond a singular focus on Marcus Garvey to recover the histories of rank and file members of the UNIA throughout the world, and in fact, Garveyites who organize outside UNIA structures. And by doing this, we've been able to expand the chronologies and geographies of Garveyism far beyond the US, and are able to locate varieties of Garveyism throughout the world that we would not have otherwise seen if we were simply focused on Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. But still, yet with very few exceptions, studies of Garveyism in Africa lag behind this developing historiography. And so this paper is part of my larger work to fill these ongoing gaps that exist in the historiography. This paper also reconsiders South African history beyond its national borders by demonstrating the centrality of Black South Africans' rich and varied interactions with overlapping Black diasporic peoples and institutions. And when I mean overlapping Black diasporic peoples, I mean Atlantic world diasporas, Caribbean peoples, African Americans, South Americans, but also continental African diasporic peoples, African peoples moving from different parts of the continent of Africa into South Africa that constitute a continental African diaspora that's often overlooked by scholars of the African diaspora. And in this particular paper, I'm looking particularly at a diaspora from Nyasaland, what is present-day Malawi, to show these dynamics of overlapping African diasporas, combining with Black South African peoples. So this combination of peoples, particularly Black sailors, and are the most effective means of Pan-African communication in this era. These are mobile Black peoples who are moving about and spreading ideas through print culture, newspapers, books, etc. And the same broad mix of people constituted Garveyites in and outside of the UNIA and South Africa. And so the lived experiences of these diverse people's political and religious movements remind us to move beyond nation-bound conceptions of South African history, which still has parochial dimensions to it that's rather stubborn. And so by doing this, I hope to offer a more expansive geographical global Africa framework that links often separate African and African diaspora histories. So our keynote today, Professor Mamdani and his work, demonstrates these dynamics of the distinction between so-called civilized whites and their colonial projects and those regarded as outside the modern nation state. And thus not deserving of rights. And of course, in South Africa, most whites at this time believed that colonial rule in Africa and elsewhere was the inevitable result of Europeans' 2,000-year historical progression, supposedly, to the highest civilization, while Africans and diasporic Blacks in this worldview supposedly had no history and remained stuck in a timeless, primitive, static existence of barbarism. Now, many Garveyites within and outside of South Africa fought white supremacy on political and theological grounds, centering themselves as dynamic historical actors within a millennia-long historical drama connecting their 20th century lives to ancient biblical history. Many claim to be modern-day Israelites, divinely ordained to escape political and spiritual bondage, a racial subordination to create an earthly Zion, a more just, humane, and moral New World Order. Garveyites in South Africa expressed their liberationist aspirations and political grievances in a prophetic Christianity that reflected their close reading of Judeo-Christian biblical texts, rituals, symbolism, and metaphors to legitimate their claims for African independence. South African UNIA division meetings presided over by UNIA chaplains and held on Sunday afternoons had a deeply religious quality. Inevitably, speakers referenced Psalm 68:31, which proclaimed that princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God. For Garveyites, Garvey was the prince delivering his people from Pharaoh. Ethiopia symbolized a Black nation in communing with a God that had assigned it a providential role in world affairs. They compared their experiences in segregation in South Africa to the children of Israel. And like the British Guyanese-born Timothy Robertson, who was Cape Town's leading UNIA organizer, they viewed Garveyism as a true Moses who would emancipate the children of Ethiopia from the fetters of bondage. We often see these quotes in the pages of the Negro World, the UNIA newspaper. Garveyites from around the world would write, giving details about local varieties of Garveyism, their activism, and we find these passages in the Negro World, right? If Garvey was the modern Moses that transmitted God's mandate, then Garveyites were soldiers proselytizing for the UNIA orthodoxy, who preached the doctrine of the UNIA, the first gospel of Garveyism. And in the pages of the Negro World, we see this type of language, for instance, that the Negro world must be a Bible to us. Garveyites proclaim that even the deaf, dumb, and half dead have caught the vision of Mr. Garvey, that Africa must be freed from the exploiters, since Garveyism was the shalom pool that granted sight to formerly blind and helpless Blacks wandering in the wilderness of white supremacy. For Blacks awaiting the coming of the Messiah and the subsequent entrance into God's kingdom, the Shalom Pool references were particularly suggestive. The Shalom Pool story, which is found in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 39, links the liberationist prophecies of Isaiah 35:5 and Isaiah 42:7 with Jesus' most common messianic faith healing activity of granting eyesight in both a physical and spiritual sense, so that the works of God can manifest in God's chosen people. Garveyites also references biblical passages like Genesis 1:27. God created man in his own image. In Revelation 7, verses 9 and 10, there was a great multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language standing before the throne, and they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God." To prove that God created humans in his own image and that there was divine sanction to the principle of human equality, Garveyites also found support for their belief that God had designated Africa for the Africans in Acts 17:26. From one man, he made every nation of men that they should inherit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. In response to Garvey's politically motivated conviction on mail fraud in 1923, South African Garveyites increasingly viewed Garvey not as a modern-day Moses, but now transformed as a Christ-like victim of state persecution. The Cape Town UNIA division chaplain evoked Jeremiah 23 to issue a stirring Jeremiad against unjust whites while assigning a glorious future for Blacks. "I will bestow punishment on you for the evil you have done, declares the Lord. I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them, and will bring them back to their pasture, where they will be fruitful and increase in number. The days are coming when I will raise up a king who will reign wisely, then they will live in their own land." Now we'll move on very quickly to show that Garveyism was moving outside of the UNIA. And as we descend to Garvey in the UNIA, we see a broader view of Garveyism's impact and the impact of overlapping diasporas again. We see Garveyism in the ANC, the African National Congress, and in the era's leading Black trade union, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, otherwise known as the ICU. It had an estimated 100,000 members at its 1927 peak. And the ICU leader throughout much of the 1920s was Clemens Kadali from colonial Nyasaland, what is currently Malawi. And Kadali represented this larger Nyasaland African diaspora, primarily a labor diaspora, but many, like Kadali, worked as clerks or were leaders in these type of trade unions. And so I'm running out of time, but I would simply want to show that there were a number of Nyasalanders, including George Wellington Kampara and Peter Nyambo, who combined with West Indians like James Taylor and James Gums and a number of Black South Africans in the ICU leadership, in the UNIA leadership, and the ANC leadership. We also see too the eastward movement of churches started by Caribbean peoples developing in North America and making their way across the water into South Africa. Two quick examples: the African Orthodox Church and the House of Atholi. Both of these churches started by Black West Indians. And McGuire, the leader of the African Orthodox Church, was also not only the UNIA chaplain general, but also an author of two UNIA sacred texts: the Universal Negro Catechism, which claimed that God had ordained the UNIA to redeem Africa, and the Universal Negro Ritual, which contained nearly 150 hymns, prayers, and songs for UNIA events. Moving forward, Richard Athley Rogers started the House of Atholi. His sacred text was the Holy Piby, the Black man's Bible, which had 12 commandments asserting that Blacks could not attain the kingdom of God by passively waiting for heavenly rewards, but only by demanding social justice on earth. Time does not permit me to go into a longer story here, but suffice to say that the Holy Piby eventually became one of the foundational texts for Jamaica's Rastafarian movement. It interpreted the Battle of Adwa, in which Ethiopia defeated Italy in 1896, as a sign of impending Black liberation. And so to conclude, the deeply religious character of the UNIA was reflected in Marcus Garvey's view that the UNIA was a civil religion, a great all-comprehensive racial missionary movement, a holy cause to which every Negro should give undivided allegiance. And this religious dimension to the UNIA still remains largely unappreciated by scholars, even Garvey scholars. Transnational Black peoples had expansive conceptions of liberation beyond just the political secular realm. They created their own Black-led political and religious communities that viewed Jesus Christ as the champion of the dispossessed and Christianity as a stirring social gospel of justice, freedom, and equality. Evoking the Old Testament biblical Israelites escaping Pharaonic Egypt after 400 years of bondage, and the New Testament early Christians spreading their faith and building new churches despite state persecution, these modern day South African and continental and Atlantic diasporic peoples together refused restrictive national and temporal containers to center themselves within ancient but ongoing biblical histories and to forge transnational connections to sing their own redemption songs. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Vincent, for a really, really fascinating paper. I really appreciated it. We have time for at least one question from the audience or from any of the fellow panelists, so please. We'll just one more second to weigh in. If nobody else has a question, I certainly do. Great. We got one. Oh, we got two. Excellent. I will try to combine them together. One question from Paul Banda is in regard to the future of Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. And then from Professor Oludamini Ogunike, he says, thank you so much for this rich presentation. I learned so much. Can you comment on the presence of the UNIA on the continent beyond Southern Africa? Mm-hmm. So the future and beyond Southern Africa.
Sure. So thank you for these questions. I think Garvey scholars are uncovering more research, building on earlier scholars looking at Garveyism, particularly in West Africa and Central Africa. And so outside of Southern Africa, I think that the emerging scholarship over the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years has really shown the connections of the movement of Garveyism with through Southern Africa into Central Africa, into what is now the Congo, the DRC. And this is mostly the spread of Garveyism that connects Central and Southern Africa, and to some extent East Africa, is primarily through colonial labor networks, North-South networks for so many Central Africans working in South African mines, for instance. They were the conveyors of this information going back and forth. So that Nyasaland diaspora sort of represents that phenomenon. We also have a few more studies on Garveyism in West Africa, but we still need far more scholarship outside of those areas and to show all these different connections. And what we're seeing though, is that they are not discrete regions of Garveyism per se. Yes, they're grounded in particular regions, but we're discovering that they're often connected to each other, right? Primarily through mobile people who are spreading these ideas orally, sometimes through print culture. So it's really tracing mobile Black people, either as labor migrants, sailors. And when we do that, we see that they're connecting regions throughout Africa. So I think that's where African Garveyism is going, but it still remains the most underdeveloped, I think, region, as well as South America, in understanding the global phenomenon of Garveyism. To the question of 21st century Pan-Africanism, that is the question, I think, of where we go. I think for many in the diaspora, Pan-Africanism has been made legible by fighting against forms of white supremacy. So that becomes a common sort of framework in which very diverse Black peoples around the world may be able to organize and to find commonalities. And, you know, obviously white supremacy has not gone anywhere. It shapeshifts, it morphs into different ways. But quite often, I think for those in the diaspora, we have to maintain that sort of racial consciousness. And that's Black people on the continent as well. Maintain that sort of racial consciousness, but also understand that there are forms of Pan-Africanism that need to be deployed, not always just against forms of white supremacy, right? So how do we engage what's maybe happening in Sudan or you know, different, or in Ethiopia? How do we think about Pan-Africanism here? What is the place of Pan-Africanism when we think about dynamics on the continent where it's not a you know, cut and dry white versus Black issue? So I think that is you know, perhaps future pathways for Pan-Africanism.
Thank you so much, Professor Vincent, for a fascinating conversation. There are other questions, but they'll be sent to you so that you can respond later. Moving on now to Dr. Nasima Muhammad's paper, Religion and Philosophy in the Zimbabwean African People's Union Army.
Oh, thank you very much. I give a little more description on the title for my talk. Thank you to the organizers of this conference. It's wonderful to be here and to hear from my fellow presenters. The title of my talk is The Zimbabwean Russian, the Zim Russian, the Reluctant Christian, and a Recovering Atheist. 3 untold stories of the spiritual dimensions of political conflict in Zimbabwe's liberation struggle. And I give the dates 1965 to 1980. So the Zimbabwean Liberation War occurred within and in part owing to a global historical nexus of shifting political and ideological alliances. It rode the swelling wave of colonial independence movements across the African continent and occurred under the umbrella of the Cold War as the Soviet Union and China-backed liberation movements across the African continent. My 47 interviewees, which was for the project in general, fought for one of 2 of the most prominent guerrilla liberation armies and were trained by Soviet Union and its African and European allies. This paper highlights 3 of those interviews. I just wanted to, I have a dual screen. Are we able to see the full screen slide, or are my slides full screen? If somebody could let me know. Perfect, thank you. So this paper highlights 3 of those interviews. Their training, the 3 interviewee training, went beyond military support and guerrilla tactics, as they studied and reinterpreted socialist and political philosophy, each through his own experiential, intellectual, and religious lens. As part of ZAPU's curriculum, Mr. Dube, the recovering atheist, Mr. Ghazi, the Zim Russian, and Colonel MM studied dialectical materialism. 2 of them studied actually in the Soviet Union, and the imbrication of missionary Christianity and colonialism. And they all fought against a right-wing white nationalist party, Satan Twister, which embodied the symbolic relationship between colonial racism and capitalist exploitation. Yet their stories are symbolic of many which remain untold, particularly from ZAPU. While ZAPU and its military wing, the Zimbabwean African People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA, did not engage in overtly religious rituals, and their spiritual and ideological facets have long been denied by historians in the academy. This gap in this history is in part due to the targeting of ZAPU veterans post-independence, as a Zimbabwean electoral winner, Robert Mugabe and his party belonged to the Chinese-backed ZANU party, which viewed ZAPU as a threat. In essence, all party documents were confiscated and veterans were individually targeted and disappeared through infamous campaign known as Kukurahundi, in which a North Korean trained army razed the southern region, killing over 10,000. Many veterans were then too afraid and remain too afraid of the government to tell their narratives. Yet their stories, which I briefly recount here, are significant in three ways. Firstly, they challenge the present historical narratives about ZAPU's movement, which have underplayed or even denied the significance of the ideology in ZAPU's wartime operations. While I do not have the time to delve into the ways in which, for example, the military camps, their structures, mirrored the structure of missionary boarding schools, or how political commissars taught through the Socratic method pre-colonial history and discussed the moral justifications of war for soldiers, it's important to note that ideology played a central role, and religion, in both the galvanizing of individuals to pick up arms and in the overall notions of the future nation state, the divergent notions of the future nation state within the party. Secondly, by omitting the differing religious, intellectual, and ideological perspectives, assuming one can so neatly separate the three categories, we lose out on the wisdom that these veterans might share for the future of our communities and nations. We're still fighting the same exploitative global racial capitalist systems, injustices, and persecutions which they fought decades ago, as seen in present global movements, such as Black Lives Matter and Imperialists Must Fall. This slide, for example, depicts how the Rhodesian settler state has presently become a symbol of white supremacy, including in the US. Dylan Roof, who shot up a Black church, here wears the apartheid state South African flag and the Rhodesian flag on a jacket in what was his profile, his Facebook profile picture. I mean, and Professor Mamdani highlighted this morning that these narratives offer insight into roads that were not taken, which we might want to re-examine in light of our present predicaments. Finally, their narratives are valuable for their own sake. While the end resulted in their alliance to the movement, their individual reasons for doing so were the sum of their experiences, thoughts, and belief systems. Their life histories offer their answers to humanity's most significant questions. How do we define freedom, life, death? What does it mean to live life meaningfully? What is worth dying for or killing for? How do we make sense of our life's choices when we are so close to death? Despite all attending Christian academies, schools, and missionary schools, and self-identifying as Christian when they joined the revolutionary struggle, each of these three interviewees that I highlight today had a very unique and distinct religious and intellectual journey over the course of the war. And in highlighting what is lost with so Mr. Dewitt, the first interviewee and narrative, he was a self-proclaimed recovering socialist, and he was one of a handful of Africans to complete his studies at the University of Rhodesia in 1970. He worked at an insurance company while moonlighting as a ZAPU political officer before ZAPU offered him an opportunity to study material dialecticism in the Soviet Union. There he studied, including socialist political philosophy, and he shed his Christian upbringing and became an atheist. After his return to ZAPU's training camp in Zambia, he was one of 3 writers composing lectures on Marxism and atheism under the umbrella of scientific socialism that were taught across the party. However, in 1978, the Rhodesian Air Force infamously bombed the ZAPU training camp, works camp, where he was writing his manifestos. And after a miraculous survival, he re-embraced Christianity. His conversion led to an unease with the atheist assumptions, overt and covert, of dialectical materialism, and he requested to be transferred to work in ZAPU administration, where he remained until the country's independence in 1979. He is now a prominent member of religious board in Bulawayo, where he currently resides. The second interviewee, the Zim Russian, John Ghazi, was, while keenly aware of the inseparability of the colonial enterprise from missionary, and having studied in the Soviet Union, carried his Christian Bible with him all the way to the Soviet Union's military academy in Solnogorsk, which is in modern Ukraine, where he engaged in heated conversations with chief instructors of scientific socialism, eager to hear from a Zimbabwean Christian fighting a guerrilla war. He spoke to me of the similarities between the African traditional religious conception of the supreme God, Wali, and the Christian God, and the racial and political lenses that shape individual conceptions of God. He remembered his time in Russia fondly, quoting phrases in Russian and highlighting how, for those who had gone through the training in socialist political philosophy, the old ZAPU leadership were not revolutionary enough to carry out what needed to be done to build a true socialist or democratic state that did not replicate the structural problems of the Rhodesian regime. When I met the reluctant Christian, Colonel MM, in his home, he was flanked on one side by textbooks he was reading for his master's degree in conflict resolution, and by the other, his wife, whom he said was trying to convince him of Christianity. As an official in ZAPU's military wing, he recounted how he took, I beg your pardon. He recounted how he took up a traditional religious ritual at a shrine, and he went up a mountain and disappeared for over 2 weeks. He woke up with little recollection of where he was and what had happened to him, but was surrounded by what he called sacred cows, which he brought down from the mountaintop. He noted that the descendants of those cows are still in that same village, and he credits this ritual with his survival in several battles. His story is unique, but symbolic of the gaps in our historiography, because there's only one other published account of a ZAPU veteran using traditional shrines and rituals during the war. As a party is often represented as a religious and strictly military. So in conclusion, what these three unique narratives highlight is that in the midst of an overt religion in ZAPU's camps, religion played an important role in their ideological and personal evolution, as these individuals struggled to bring down the racist regime of Rhodesia. These veterans, like us, are the products of social, political, and religious historical forces before them. But their stories exemplify the significance of individual intellectual, ideological, and religious action in shaping our inner and outer worlds. It is said that when an African elder dies, a library burns down. I hope to record these narratives before these men who fought for the liberation of my country pass on, taking their libraries of knowledge and experience with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a extremely rich paper. Really, really fascinating material. And thank you for recording these stories. Okay, we have time, as with the other papers, for one question or a merging of a few questions. So I will again give half a minute for people to get their questions together. If any fellow panelists wants to jump in, that would be great as well. Okay, a question from Paul Banda. What were the Cold War powers looking for in Zimbabwe? What resources did or does Zimbabwe have?
Okay, that's a very, I don't want to go too much into the history, but at this point, even before the Zimbabwean liberation struggle, Cold War powers were already helping, for example, Algeria. It was mainly an ideological, the Cold War, as you know, was an ideological war. So both China and the Soviet Union were fighting for alliances against the US and the West. it was capitalism versus socialism and colonialism. I think beyond just, it's particularly from, and this is an important note, particularly from interviewing. So I interviewed over 50 veterans over the course of my master's and my PhD, especially the ones who went to the Soviet Union. They really felt that it was more than just an alliance of powers and that they were players on a chessboard. They really believed that the Soviet Union, just from the way that they were treated, at least ideologically, believed in not only anti-capitalism, but the end of racism and colonialism. And so that, that philosophy was very attractive to the fighters. And of course, the political alliance for the superpowers was at the time very important.
I know I'm slightly breaking the rules here, but Professor Ayodeji Ogunnaike has a question, and since his paper is next and he's only taking time from his own paper, I think we can let his question go as well. So Ayodeji, if you would like to ask your question.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Solomon. Thank you, Nasima, for this. This is a really fascinating paper. Again, just kind of upending the way that we generally approach history. And I'm curious because most other places in Africa, whenever people go to war, they always seem to have practices that they engage in to protect themselves because, it's kind of a life or death affair, especially in the case of this type of struggle. And so I'm curious if there might have been things that you came across that people may not have articulated explicitly as religious, but maybe as more cultural, that are still nevertheless tied to ancestral tradition that may have played a role, or there were just practical things that people did for safety that may not have existed on a broader ideological level that may have also influenced the way that war was carried out in this liberation struggle.
So I'm pretty sure, intuitively, I'm sure that you're right and these existed. However, in my interviews, so without going too much into the whole project, I really started this project thinking about how schools were used as tools of war, both by the liberation struggle and the Rhodesian front. And then with schools came the notions of ideology, and then with ideology, political, moral, and religious. And so the religious component really came after I had begun interviewing veterans for a while. And so I only got glimpses and gleams of the religious aspect. But I do think, and this is for my projects for the future, that these are questions that really haven't been asked of them and haven't been highlighted within the historical chapter. For example, I noticed only after doing the interviews that the way that ZAPU structured the age groups at which, for example, you were supposed to go to war, because they had these camps where if you were too young, which was I think under the age of 16, you were trained, but you weren't sent to the front lines. And so the age at which individuals were sent to the front line happened to coincide very much with the traditional, at least in Ndebele, notions of manhood and when puberty hit and when you became a man. So I do think that there are lots of these religious and symbolic institutions that were built into both the structures, official and unofficial structures, that have not yet been unearthed.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Last but certainly not least, Ayodeji Ogunnaike, Yoruba Political Ontology, Non-Competitive Democracy, and the Sacrality of Power.
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to say thank you to the organizers of the conference. This has really been fantastic, and also to my co-presenters. It's really a privilege to be on this panel with so many eminent scholars, many of whom I've looked up to for years. So this is a real pleasure on my part. I'll just assume that technology is working, but if at some point you can't hear me or you can't see things, somebody please just let me know, and I'll try to fix it along the way. So in my talk, I'm going to be building in many ways, even though I didn't plan it exactly this way, on some of the ideas and themes that were introduced by Professor Mambani in some ways in reconceptualizing ways of organizing political power and imagining community. But in one of the things that I'll touch on actually is how there might actually be ways of kind of combining state power and culture in ways that sidestep some of the problems of the nation state. And so I'll just jump right into it. To begin, I'd like to tell you two Yoruba myths for those of you who aren't familiar with them. The first is this deity Orishanla. You can see a representation here. It's kind of the primordial arch divinity in the Yoruba cosmos. And he had a servant who rolled a boulder onto his head, which has important cosmological significance for the Yoruba. And it's shattered his head into thousands, if not millions of pieces. Orishanla's friend, Orunmila, the deity of wisdom and divination, went all around the world gathering up as many of these pieces as possible to kind of reconstitute his friend. But of course, he couldn't get all of them. And the pieces that were left everywhere else became the different deities or powerful beings found all over the world, not just in Yoruba land. Now, Orishanla also had the ashe or power or authority given by Olodumare, Almighty God. He had the ashe to rule the world because he was the one who was tasked with creating it. And depending on who's telling you the story and for what purposes, in one way or the other, Oduduwa, another mythological figure, gained that ashe to rule over Ile-Ife, the first and primordial city in the world, and he gained it from Orishanla. And the office of the Oba, or the sacred king or sacred monarch, which is the foundation of Yoruba politics, ritually derives that ashe or power from Oduduwa. And so the Oduduwa is the founder, mythological founder of this Yoruba system of politics, which has lasted intact for about a millennium. And Oduduwa himself is said to have had many descendants who then left Ile-Ife and went to other towns to found them themselves and became the first sacred rulers of those domains. Those children themselves had children, and each one of those children founded a royal lineage within that particular polity. And their divine right to rule rotates in a kind of pre-organized fashion in between or from each one of those lineages, and it goes in a circular fashion. Now, when one of these lineages decides collectively on whom they would like to nominate to fill the office, that nominee has to be voted on or ratified by a council of elders, and then it subsequently has to be ratified as well through Ifa divination, the system of divination given by Orunmila. And once that takes place, there's a kind of secretive and elaborate set of rituals around initiation that take that candidate and initiate him or sometimes her into Obaship, or transfers the ashe from the Oba, or the previous person who occupied the office, into this current one, triggering an ontological transformation. And all of this represents a kind of constitutional monarchy in that the Oba themselves are not complete despots. They have a kind of social charter that's different in each area that all of them have to follow, and they can be deposed if they don't exercise their authority correctly. And in the paper, I contrast or compare and contrast this Yoruba system of political organization to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, where he famously talks about government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I highlight how this is true and not true for the Yoruba, primarily in two ways. The first is a different ontology of power, what it is and where it comes from. And the second is a difference in anthropology of what, say, a modern secular politician is, or who that person is, and then also who or what an Oba or divine monarch might be. So to answer that first question, instead of power resting with the electorate through the power or authority of casting a ballot, ashe or authority flows from the top down rather than the bottom up. It starts with Olodumare, who gave that ashe first to Orishanla, who then gave it to Oduduwa, or it was transferred to Oduduwa in one way or the other. And then from Oduduwa, it extends to the Oba themselves. And so there is a sense of democratic participation in which all of the people do get to express an opinion or a desire for a particular candidate, but the ultimate authority actually comes from above and not from below. So there are kind of higher cosmic forces that determine that. And similarly, unlike the American slogan of "E pluribus unum," right, out of many, or out of excuse me, out of many one, For the Yoruba, you actually have the opposite. So out of one, you get many. And you can see this in the way identity is formed amongst the Yoruba. Traditionally, the primary identity marker was the ancestral home or the city-state. And from there, you could get different quarters and then lineages, and then ultimately the individual is viewed as kind of an extension of each one of those identity markers, kind of like Russian nesting dolls. In this sense, the Oba does not actually unite disparate groups, but is rather the ontological source from which all of these different, this plurality emanates. So in this sense, the Oba is of the people, literally in the sense that the Oba is one with the body politic, including the citizens. So they all actually come from the Oba. The Oba is the entirety of the community. It's a government by the people in that they ritually reconstitute the kind of transcendent being of the Oba, much like Oromila tried to do by gathering the different lineages together and then ritually transforming it into this kind of primordial ancestor who existed before differentiation. It's also a government for the people because it actually exists across time and space. So it includes the ancestors, those yet to be born, perhaps, mythic ancestors, and even the land and the different spirits and things that inhabit it. So the personhood of the Oba, and then thus the form of politics and governance, embraces all of these things. And as such, it's inherently unitive rather than competitive. And this is demonstrated, as I mentioned before, by the fact that if any particular aspect of the community, whether it's a lineage, a religious group, an occupational group, isn't accurately or properly represented in the decision-making and governance, then they actually possess a certain amount of power to remove the monarch or the Oba. Furthermore, this kind of transcendent ontology of the Oba is represented in the material culture and rituals that surround the tradition. The are, which is the sacred crown passed down by Odudua, which you can see the current Oni of Ife wearing here. It contains all colors. And if you know the different beads associated with the Yoruba Orisha, you can see that, in fact, all of them are here covering the face of the Oba, which shows the unification of all of the diverse religious traditions. But also the fact that it covers his face is actually quite important because it depersonalizes the Oba and makes the Oba's identity capacious enough to incorporate or absorb or represent or embody all of the various different identities that are present across space and time. Furthermore, the town or Ilu radiates out from the central point of the palace Afin, or the place where the Oba is located. So it emanates from there. And the Afin itself is also a microcosm of the polity, and that all of the different groups come there to perform rituals on behalf of the Oba and on behalf of the whole community at large. And every year there are annual rituals of renewal, and the Oba plays the key role in this process of the renewal of the cosmos, usually including some type of ritual reenactment of the mythic past and founding of the whole community. And I don't have time to get into all of it here, unfortunately. But one of the most interesting things that I did want to mention was that this tradition is a millennium old, and it's proven incredibly resilient, even in the face of the diaspora caused by the Atlantic slave trade. And it has also responded to Western modernity in that context, in the colonial context in Nigeria, in very remarkable ways. So first in Sierra Leone, when Yoruba people were brought there by the British, one of the first things they did in the 19th century was actually to recreate this tradition of sacred kingship or monarchy, even including those who were perhaps not Yoruba, despite the fact that even the Yoruba members of the community all came from different polities. They came together and reconstituted it, or used it perhaps to reconstitute their own community. And furthermore, although this is generally overlooked by scholars, in places like Cuba and Brazil, it was recreated in a very kind of creative and an innovative way, rooted primarily in Catholic lay brotherhoods, irmandades or cabildos. And every year they would elect a ritual king and usually queen. And it formed a kind of effective civil religion that provided a shared sense of rituals, symbols, and identity that everyone could participate in. And it allowed them to even absorb members of other ethnic groups, to interact with Congolese forms of monarchy. And what I find really fascinating here is that it also allowed it to, beyond just building a sense of solidarity in a very harsh climate, it provided an incubator for some of the most prominent diaspora religions in the world today, including Regla de Ocha and Candomblé, by creating a context in which linkages or connections could be formed, or they could bind together all of the different religious traditions brought from various places, mostly in West Africa, in a way that would allow them to then become what we would now call religions during the later colonial era and post-colonial era. I also find this form of politics very fascinating because it sheds a kind of critical light on modern secular politics in Nigeria, primarily because it doesn't have any religious secular divide, which is of course foreign to indigenous traditions, and you could argue even for modern political activity in Nigeria at large, particularly as secularization theory has been very much debunked in Africa. It means there's a kind of lack of a robust structure for appropriate or productive religious and political interaction in the modern secular sphere of Nigerian politics. But this offers a kind of more robust and productive way of doing it. Furthermore, with modern politics in Nigeria, there's a high politicization of the personal identity, specifically religious, but then also ethnic and otherwise, which kind of contradicts the common logic around the importance of secularism in governance. So instead of providing a neutral arena where everyone can feel enabled to participate, what we actually see in Nigeria now is there's an arena for competition for the natural resources along religious and ethnic lines, which just kind of heightens the tension and it reifies or deepens whatever divides already exist. However, for the Oba, you see a bit of the opposite, or at least in theory, that's the way that it's meant to work, through the sacred canopy that's created. And Professor Jacob Olukmana is the one who's really advanced this idea. The sacred canopy, drawn from Peter Berger's work, involves an externalization of an idea of the cosmos of the society and how it's supposed to operate, that emanates, in this case, from the Oba, him or herself, that then gets objectified or reified in society through the exercise of asher or authority or power. And then by creating those structures externally, they then get internalized by the citizens, and then the process kind of keeps going around in a circle. With respect to modern politics, the ballot box has proved a very ineffective mode of holding leaders accountable. But in the tradition of the Oba, you actually have the asher or authority flowing from the top down. And because it flows through multiple traditions as well, it can at times be withdrawn by those who have privileged access to these ontologically higher levels. And this is why that authority needs to be renewed every year by these specific stakeholders. So these different religious groups, for example, every year the Oba has to be present at their annual festivals, and their own particular type of power and authority has to be reinvested in the Oba. And it's a big crisis if that doesn't happen. And this effectively ensures power for all minority interests, regardless of how small they are, and regardless of how long they may have been in that area or not. So to round up, the reasons why this form of politics is quite fascinating and offers a lot of benefits for thinking beyond the kind of modern secular nature or structure of the Nigerian state is the effective merger of religious and secular authority in a kind of productive fashion. The notion of asher or power and authority being rooted in the divine rather than a human source, which allows it to transcend difference, and then also allows for this particular Yoruba ontology of the Oba being divine and the literal and symbolic unifier of all people present within the territory or the polis. It's also furthermore mediated through ritual and reinforced through it. And it's proven to be remarkably durable and elastic to the extent that those enslaved chose to recreate it and draw other people who did not share their ethnicity into the tradition. And I'll close finally with a funny quote I got from a Babalawo or an Ifa priest with whom I did research once. I told him that there were no divine kings or queens in the US. And he prayed and said, God, don't ever let that happen in Nigeria. No matter how good a politician is, that politician must never take the place of an Oba. And so I'll end my presentation there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Oguneke. Really thought-provoking presentation. I really appreciate it. We are technically out of time, but we can squeeze in certainly one question. So please, any fellow panelists or people in the audience, we'd love to hear from you. We actually do have a question already. From Creighton Coleman, writes, amazing presentation. I really appreciate your work. I had two questions. What do we miss when we think of power in Yorubaland in terms of sovereignty, popular or divine, rather than, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Ashe, is that correct? Okay. And then the second question, how has the power authority of the Oba changed since the, again, a word I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce right, Oni?
The Ani.
Ani of Ife left his palace in 1903.
Great. Well, thank you. These are two great questions. I think the first one points to an issue raised by both Professor Mugane at Harvard, and then with this case specifically, Professor Roland Abiodun, about the importance of using indigenous terms and concepts when you're dealing with issues like this. Of course, Ashe is a bit more expansive than the notions of, say, sovereignty. It really carries connotations of kind of effective power. Say the ability of what you say to come to pass. So for example, when the Oni is wearing the are, he needs to keep quiet, because if he says something negative, it's supposed to just happen right then and there. So it moves far beyond the idea of sovereignty or just the ability to exercise some kind of political power, which is how we tend to think of it in that realm. Even if we say, oh, you have the divine right to rule, God gave you the right to rule. It's a bit more like, no, God has given you the power to make things happen, right? And so Ashe carries a sort of different notion there. And then furthermore, as you said, if you think of them and it's popular or divine, it implies that there are kind of two different types of power there. Whereas for the Yoruba, traditionally, there's no division between those whatsoever. If you have Ashe, the only type of power that exists is power that ultimately flows from Olodumare. So I think that's maybe how I would approach that one is it fundamentally changes the ontology of what power is, and then also how you can exercise it, and then also how you can access it. And it will change the way you start thinking about, say, symbols, perhaps, and thus the rituals and why the rituals are really important, especially with some of the controversies going on at the moment about what to do when an Oba needs to be buried and there's a succession issue. Thinking in terms less of kind of modern law and more in terms of Ashe and how Ashe is transferred might actually help us manage those kinds of things a bit better. The second part of the question about how let me see if I can find it again, how it's changed since the Ani left the palace in 1903 to go meet the British in the colonial powers in Lagos. Professor Lupana is the one who's done the most work on this, so I should really defer to him, and we'll hear from him later in the conference, so maybe he'll have more to say on it. But I think one of the changes that has occurred is that this transcendent nature of the Oba, many of the people with whom I've spoken, especially the leading Orisha practitioners, have this clear understanding that the Oba is not a person. That's why there's a taboo around saying the Oba has actually died. They understand that the Oba is literally a different type of being. And that's why oftentimes they compare the Oba to an Orisha. The movement of the Oba from the palace, and then also other developments like photographing the face of the Oba without it being covered, I don't want to say it erodes it, but it allows more room for people to understand the Oba more as just another person who happens to have, let's say, perhaps political authority. So much like there's a taboo around saying that there's a person in a Gungun ancestral masquerade, it's like everybody knows there's a human being there, but you're not supposed to talk about it in those terms because you privilege a different type of ontology. So I think that change, which was very important, and you can read Professor Lupana's book, City of 201 Gods, to read a bit more about some of the ripple effects of that kind of watershed moment. I think it opens up the possibility for reinterpreting the Oba, the office, and their ontology in kind of more modern ways. You don't have to do it, but I think it makes it more of a possibility. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you so much, Professor Oguneke. And with that to conclude, I'd like to thank our speakers for 6 truly path-breaking presentations. I really learned so much today and just can't wait to read more of all of your work. Much gratitude as well to everyone who joined our conversation today. As a reminder, this current session was recorded and will soon be available on the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab's Vimeo site. A link will be shared with attendees. We hope very much that you'll all join us again tomorrow at 10 a.m. US Eastern Time for the panel Contemporary Conflicts, the State and Religion in Africa. The Zoom link for the next panel can be found on the conference website. Thanks again and good night, everybody.